There are some stories that don't need any kind of drama to make an impact. They don't need that hook or that twist ending or any kind of clever title. Some stories just sit really heavy in your chest from the very first line because you already know how they're going to end. And even though we already know the ending, we listen anyways because someone's daughter deserves to be remembered, and this is one of those stories. We are in Yellowknife today in May of 2020. Now, spring in the north is kind of a relative concept. I mean, technically, the calendar says it's warming up, but the wind that's coming off the Great Slave Lake is probably doing its best impression of January. It is that time of year, though, when people start kind of emerging from their winter shells, reconnecting with people, stretching their shoulders a little bit. And for a young woman named Breanna Menacho, or Bree, that meant time with her friends, time out in the community, and just spending time with the people that she really loved. Now, before I go any further, I just should probably give you a quick sense of Yellowknife, especially if you've never been. And like me, you kind of keep saying you're always going to go, and then you just kind of never do. It's one of those places that I think you think you understand it because it's up north, but it's kind of a whole world of its own. Yellowknife sits on the edge of the Great Slave Lake, which is less of a lake and more like an inland ocean. The landscape is all ancient rock, water, big sky, the kind of place that just makes you feel small, but in a way that I think is actually really grounding. It's the capital of the Northwest Territories, but it still has that frontier personality, part government town, part rugged northern outpost. The weather, of course, is the north, so it's cold, and it's that kind of cold that actually means business, like the kind where you look out your window sometimes and immediately rethink all your life choices. But people there are used to that, and I think there's something really beautiful in that resilience. It's also one of those communities where people do know each other, and not in that small town, everyone judges your lawn kind of way, but in that genuinely interconnected northern way where you notice when someone isn't around. And when something happens to one person, it kind of happens to everyone. And that's the environment that Bree grew up in, that tight knit northern place where connections run deep and where a loss isn't just a headline, it's actually really personal. Bree was 22. She was a Dene woman who lived in Yellowknife, Enzo, and Toledo, and everyone, and I mean everyone, describes her the same way: warm. She was the kind of person who hugged first and asked questions later, and the kind of young woman that made the room just feel better by being in it. And her mom said that she protected people, and not in that kind of superhero way, just in that everyday way that really kind people do. She paid attention, she cared, and she made you feel cared about. And if you've ever lost somebody like that, someone who's like the glue of a family, that emotional thermostat, you know how devastating that loss is. It changes the entire temperature of your world. Now, nothing in Bree's life was heading towards any kind of tragedy. She wasn't in some kind of escalating conflict. She wasn't afraid of someone. She wasn't living a dangerous lifestyle. She was just 22 years old, doing what 22-year-olds do, hanging out, spending time with people, her friends that she thought were safe. And one of those people, and unfortunately the one that would take her life, was a man named Devon Larabie. Now, he was older than her. He was 31 at the time and deeply entrenched in addictions: alcohol, crack cocaine, just chaotic living. I mean, you know the type, the kind of guy that this justice system seems to bend over backwards to understand and contextualize, but rarely with the same energy that they give for the victims that they leave behind. They were not a couple. They weren't romantically involved in any way. They were just in the same place, in that same circle at the same time, just sitting on a couch in an apartment in Yellowknife on a May evening. And I need to say this very, very clearly. Bree was not doing anything wrong. She wasn't provoking anything. She wasn't walking into danger knowingly. She was literally just there. Larabie, meanwhile, was spiraling, not gradually, not subtly. This was the kind of binge where reality starts to slip. And this right here is why the North struggles so deeply with violent crime. Isolation, limited treatment resources, generational trauma, addiction, and the kind of housing instability that lets chaos walk right through the front door. But we're going to get to that later. Right now, we are still in this apartment. Now, later the court would hear that Larabie had acted suddenly. There was no argument, no lead up, no threat, no defensive movement. It was just one of those horrifying split-second ruptures where the human brain seems to fail at being human. He, at that time, reached for a hatchet. Now, that's something that I think no one should ever have within an arm's reach, whether you're sober or not. And he attacked Bree where she was sitting. So it was so fast that she didn't have time to move, let alone defend herself in any way. And we're gonna get there. And he didn't just stop at killing her, he actually tried to hide the body. Like a 22-year-old woman who had done nothing but exist peacefully in his company. He dragged her, placed her in a chest freezer, and then in a detail that I think will haunt the courtroom later, he actually tried to persuade other people to help him cover it up, which they refused. Like, they called for help. So someone still had a conscience that day. And when the RCMP arrived, they found Bree's body inside that freezer, and they arrested him soon after that. And from that moment forward, the story then becomes one of grief, justice, and the far too familiar of an experience of an Indigenous family having to sit through a system that is much better at explaining an offender than remembering a victim. But again, we're going to get to all that. We are still at the beginning of Bree's story, the part where she's still alive, she's still radiant, and she's still the girl that hugged people first and asked questions later. And so as we move forward in this story, I want you to hold her and not him at the center of it. He will get his day in court, but Bree, she only gets this story. And it's probably a story that you won't hear on a lot of other podcasts because it doesn't get a lot of media attention. So when the RCMP arrived that day, it was something that was going to haunt a lot of seasoned officers, because I don't think it matters how long you've been doing the job. You do not forget scenes like this. Like, you don't forget what a young woman's life looks like after someone else decided to destroy it. So they found Bree's body inside this freezer, which is, I think, a detail that shouldn't ever exist in any sentence anywhere. And in Yellowknife, officers see a lot of domestic violence and more addiction-driven chaos than a city their size should ever have to. But this stood out as something that was especially cruel. So as I said, Larabie was arrested not long after that. He did not run. He didn't try to hide. He just kind of was there in that strange, altered state that heavy addiction creates, where it's shock, fear, denial, disassociation. They all kind of get tangled together, and even the person can't fully articulate what they've done. But the people around him, fortunately, they knew that something was wrong immediately, because what he had asked them to do to help him hide this young woman's body, like to make her disappear. They outright refused. And I don't know whether he called one person or a couple of people, but I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that somebody did the right thing. And they did it really fast. Like they called the RCMP, they spoke up, and they kept Bree from becoming just another missing woman in the North. Another case where a family waits days or weeks for answers that come too late. Because in Yellowknife, as in any northern community, when somebody goes missing, time is not on your side. Weather is not on your side, the geography isn't on your side, and limited policing resources are definitely not on your side. And so these people, whoever they were, ensured that Bree's family didn't have to endure that kind of additional agony. So take a moment to thank them for that. And Yellowknife is not a place where crime is just kind of background noise for them. It's not Toronto or Calgary where tragedies kind of blend into those usual headlines. Up there, people really feel it. And so the news spread really quickly that this young woman had died. A man had been arrested, and the details, of course, were horrific and very intimate. And you could feel the way the community was reacting to this. I mean, there was shock at first, and then sadness, and then this familiar frustration that comes from knowing that this is not the first Indigenous woman that's lost to violence, and it certainly will not be the last. And people who knew Bree talked about her smile and her hugs and the way that she lit up a room. And people who didn't know her were also heartbroken anyways, because that's kind of the thing in northern towns. Like, closeness defines the people there. So the forensic team processed the apartment, the freezer, all the surrounding areas, and they built the timeline that Bree and Larabie were sitting together on the couch. There was no fight, no warning, no kind of self-defense claim or anything like that. And he had just reached for this hatchet, and that was it. And after he had attacked her with the hatchet, he attempted to conceal her body. And he was phoning around and asking other people to cover it up. So when the police questioned him, he admitted what he had done. And he did later plead guilty. So there was no long trial, no defense theory that they had to come up with, and no attempt to shift the blame onto Bree or anyone else. I mean, it was honest in the way that these kind of crimes are. And when the police had notified Bree's family, it's like your world just cracks into two, before and after, because parents are obviously not meant to bury their children, and siblings aren't meant to go through the rest of their life for these empty places beside them. And when you lose someone to violence, everyone suffers. And Indigenous families in the North suffer with that history behind them, a long, painful record of systemic neglect, under investigation, over explanation for the perpetrators, and under recognition for the victims. And Bree's mom would later stand up in court and talk about who her daughter really was, that she was not a statistic, not just a name in some news headline. She was a human being with dreams and love and years that she really should have had ahead of her. And she talked about how often the justice system bends over backwards to focus on the trauma of Indigenous offenders, and how the trauma of Indigenous victims barely gets any kind of footnote. And I think if that line doesn't hit you square in the chest, then you're not listening close enough. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that I'm not saying that, I'm actually not saying anything about Indigenous offenders. I feel very strongly in support of Indigenous victims and their families. And this is an issue that has come up a number of times in the court system. And in this case, it particularly involves an Indigenous offender. but I don't want to make a complete divide between Indigenous victims and Indigenous offenders, because I do recognize and I want to acknowledge that there is intergenerational trauma that affects both sides. I think my point that I'm going to be getting to has more to do with Indigenous, with that intergenerational trauma and a person's response to it, and how we need to navigate that a little bit better. So I just want to make that clear, because I don't want to come out saying that like, oh, all that really matters is Indigenous victims and not necessarily Indigenous people in general who maybe commit other offenses due to some intergenerational trauma that has led to their life choices. It's a very, very complicated issue, and I want to stick to a specific topic around it and not make generalizations about other pieces of that history that's there. So by the time that the case reached court, the facts were definitely not in any kind of dispute. There's no mystery here to unravel, and no defense strategy that's going to come out of the shadows here, or speculation. Devon Larabie admitted what he had done. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, which in Canada here means life in prison. And then there's a fight over that parole eligibility period. And that fight, sort of that negotiation between what a person did and then how long they have to wait before the system allows them to kind of try again, is where so many families feel like collateral damage. So in May of 2024, which was the sentencing hearing, they heard the agreed statement of facts. And I really don't care how composed a judge may look in that case, or how many years a prosecutor has under their belt, or even how long a journalist has been covering violence. I think this case hits very differently, because we're talking about a young woman who was just sitting on a couch, a completely unprovoked attack with a hatchet, and then her body placed in a freezer like meat. And then that attempt to try to get other people to help hide her. And really, some details should just never have to be spoken in a courtroom at all. But in Canada, sentencing isn't just about that act, it's about context. And so this is the part that gets my blood pressure a little bit higher, because the court has to, by law, consider the offender's background, their trauma, their substance use, their intergenerational trauma, any brain injuries they may have, and every possible mitigating factor under the sun. And the Crown Attorney described Larabie's actions as brutal and unprovoked, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But the defense pointed out that he had this lifelong struggle with addiction, trauma, he had some chaotic living conditions, and they presented the standard GLADU considerations for Indigenous offenders: childhood instability, colonization's impact, cycles of addiction and violence that he grew up around, and the systemic gaps that kind of shaped his life. Now, none of that excuses murder, but in the Canadian justice system, it always becomes part of the narrative, always. And for families, that part is excruciating. Because here's the truth that nobody really likes saying out loud. Focusing on the offender's pain can sometimes feel like a second wound for the victim's family. So during victim impact statements, Bree's mom was standing there, as mothers have to do in courtrooms, trying to basically do the impossible job of summarizing her daughter's life and the loss that she had in this space of like a couple of minutes, about her kindness, her hugs, the way that she protected people. But she said something that I think should kind of echo across all courtrooms in this country. She said, quote, "We hear about the trauma of Indigenous offenders, but what about the trauma of Indigenous victims and their families?" End quote. And I think she's right. Indigenous offenders get paragraphs of context, and not just Indigenous offenders, offenders of all types. Now, the judge ultimately handed down the life in prison, but with a parole eligibility period after 10 years, which is kind of standard for second degree. But the fun part, and I mean fun in a way that you have to laugh about it because, I mean, otherwise you'd cry, is that he had already spent 4 years in custody waiting for this case to resolve. So he'll actually be eligible for parole in about 6 years. Now, it doesn't mean that he's going to get it, but he's eligible, and eligible is eligible. Now, the judge had said that his actions were horrific, violent, and senseless, which I don't think there's any argument about that. But they also acknowledged his trauma, his addiction, and the impact of colonization, which is also true. I want to be clear about that. That is true. But this is the tension that we kind of keep running into. Acknowledging offenders' pain doesn't resurrect the person that they killed. And the balance in the courtroom that they're trying to strike is that it's real, it's important, but it leaves families feeling like someone's trying to like pour equal parts justice and empathy into a cup that was completely broken long before the sentencing even started. And so Yellowknife reacted the way I think a lot of people do. That and in their case, they felt as a community that their grief was very personal. And so they talked about how unfair that really felt for them, and how Bree was, she was the kind of person that just, like, her death was just another reminder of the vulnerability Indigenous women face up in the North and everywhere, where isolation, addiction, limited supports, and generational trauma create these conditions that the justice system reacts to, but rarely ever prevents. And so people also recognize that the sentence was within the standard range, but it did not feel like enough. And not because a harsher punishment was going to fix anything. I mean, obviously it wouldn't. But that gap between the harm that was done and the system's response always feels bigger for the victims than I think anyone else in that whole process. So after that, the legal system kind of closed the file. But for Bree's family, I mean, there is no closure, because I think closure is fiction that we kind of tell ourselves, but there's never any. So all they really got was an outcome, right? They got a verdict, a number of years, a timeline for that parole. But it's just not justice in any kind of emotional sense. It's just in an administrative sense. And that's where my little side topic today is going to begin, because Bree didn't die in a vacuum. She died in a context that is shared by too many Northern Indigenous women living in places where geography, history, systems, and circumstance overlap in some really dangerous ways. When someone dies violently, the first thing that people ask all the time is, why? Why her? Why there? Why did this happen? But in the North, that question isn't just about one moment in an apartment. It's about the whole landscape, the lack of services, the history that is written into the DNA of the place. It's about geography and systems and every tiny little crack in those floorboards where people like Bree fall through long before anybody even notices. Because reality is, in Northern Canada, isolation isn't just physical, it's systemic, and it's deadly. Geography does not care about you. The North is extremely stunning. It's beautiful, it's rugged, it's full of culture and this resilience, but it is also a place where services are really far apart and treatment programs are short term. They're waitlisted all the time. emergency response systems are stretched really thin because they have such distance to travel over, and that weather can ground flights, close roads, derail investigations, and sometimes the nearest resource is actually hundreds of kilometers away. So if you're struggling with addiction, there might be only one detox facility anywhere even somewhat close to you. If you're a woman facing violence, the local shelter is probably full, maybe even non-existent where you are. And if you're in a crisis, a 911 call in these remote communities doesn't always get the cavalry running. It summons who's ever closest and kind of hoping for some backup. Larabie didn't become who he was in isolation from all of that. And Bree didn't lose her life in isolation from it either. People love to say that addiction is everywhere, and it absolutely is. But addiction in northern communities hits a little bit differently because it is tied to that intergenerational trauma, colonization, some housing instability, lack of mental health services, and limited treatment beds. Also due to cultural dislocation, poverty, childhood exposures to violence, and you can't separate a crime from the literal soil that it grew up in. So what happened to Bree wasn't, I mean, it's not the inevitable result of living in the North, but it was certainly shaped by it, because in places where trauma goes untreated, then violence kind of grows. And in places where that support is really scarce, hard to come by, victims become even more vulnerable. Now, this particular topic is very uncomfortable, and I think people tend to handle it with oven mitts on, but we're going to just say it out loud. In Canada, the justice system devotes entire chapters to the trauma of Indigenous offenders and barely a paragraph to the trauma of Indigenous victims. And we see this pattern again and again. Judges weighing in on a person's childhood, their addiction issues, instability, any exposure that they had to violence in their childhood, and their unresolved pain, which is all real and it's all relevant. And I think it's even all important. But what about a victim's childhood, their future, their unresolved pain, which is now their family's pain? And Bree's mom called that out directly and said the thing that most people just kind of whisper about. And I think that she was right. Victims deserve the same depth of context, respect, attention, and compassion that the offenders get, because the scale is constantly tipping one way, and families like hers are then left holding on to that imbalance. When an Indigenous woman is murdered in Toronto, it is treated as an individual tragedy. But when she's murdered in Yellowknife, it becomes something else. It's like a reflection of every missing woman, every under-resourced community, and every time someone was told, well, there's nowhere to go. Every statistic people like to quote without ever sitting with the weight of those statistics, because Bree was not a statistic, but her death lives in that same statistical universe as too many others do, because women in the North, and especially Indigenous women, face higher risks because of that isolation, that limited housing, relationship dependency, community pressures, and lack of shelters, as well as addiction crises that are happening around them. Everything is understaffed, and bluntly, the simple fact is that leaving is not always an option when your nearest escape route involves a flight or ferries or some kind of ice road, or just praying that there's a shelter bed open somewhere. So just walk away is kind of a really cruel joke to them. So Bree deserved to live in a world where addiction services are accessible, housing is not chaotic and sparse, and her killer had some meaningful support long before this ever happened. Communities aren't forced to shoulder the burden of these broken systems, and violence against Indigenous women was not something that everyone just expected, tolerated, or just explained away. Instead, she got a sentencing hearing where her life had to compete with someone else's trauma for space. And her family got 6 more years until he's eligible for parole. And so I think that Bree's murder brings up a really important topic and something that nobody ever wants to talk about. And that is that whole, like, how much trauma is responsible for your behaviors, and how we look at those things in a court system, and why we use these mitigating factors in sentences, because victims don't get that same treatment. Now, I have an episode of my Let's Talk About Murder coming out that's going to talk about that in specifically as trauma as an excuse for murder, because in the end, you can't. I feel really bad for people that have trauma in their lives, and the intergenerational trauma that Indigenous families have been through, and the history that is written into those families it's horrific, and it's awful. It's inexcusable. It's a terrible tragedy, and I totally acknowledge their trauma. But at what point are we then responsible for our responses to that trauma? And I mean, I think that's I think that's an easy question to answer for, someone who's not in a marginalized community. I've had some trauma in my life, and I'm certainly feel like I'm responsible for my actions here out and how I respond to that trauma. But when we are talking about intergenerational trauma caused by colonization and the impact that has had on Indigenous families for years, and I mean for generations, it's a little bit more complicated, because I do get it. I do understand that obviously that's a trauma that I have the luxury of not having to understand it. A really complicated issue, but I think it's definitely something that we need to be talking more about and exploring these GLADU reports that are done for Indigenous offenders. I see their purpose, and I do understand that, but I think they need to be, rather than being used towards sentencing, I think they need to be used as a reflection of maybe some services that need to be out there to prevent violent crimes from happening in Indigenous communities by Indigenous offenders and to Indigenous victims, or any victim of any race, culture, religion. Super complicated topic. And poor Bree. I mean, to just be literally just sitting on a couch, and then to get hacked to death with a hatchet just sounds horrific. And for him to try to involve friends in, like, oh, can you help me hide the body? I don't get it. I'm so glad they came forward right away and called the police, because I mean, I guess that some of them, maybe if they were friends that were in similar cycles of addiction, they could have easily just said, like, oh, okay, or just ignored it, or I don't know. So really bizarre story. I wish I had a lot more details about it for you, but I don't. It happened in Yellowknife, and there's just not a lot of news coverage out there. I have an episode about that on Let's Talk About Murder as well, about how media coverage affects podcast coverages. Kind of an interesting subject. Anyways, I'm going to be back again in next week with another episode for you. In the meantime, you know what to do. Rates, reviews, all that stuff. And as always, thank you so much for listening and for watching.